We're now joined by Zeenat Adam, who's the Deputy Executive Director for the Afro-Middle East Center. Zeenat, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Good to always have you on the program. So a new era is dawned in Afghanistan.
It absolutely has, and contrary to what Joe Biden is saying and hailing as an extraordinary success, it's been an absolute disaster for him and really an insult to the empire. I think that this defeat has really brought them down. There was a last-ditch effort trying to have the UN Security Council resolution passed last night to lay responsibility at the feet of the Taliban about safe passage for any Afghans who want to continue to travel outside of the country. But this received a resounding acceptance by the P3 and their allies. And then we had deep criticism coming out from Russia and from China. I found the Chinese statement after the adoption of the resolution quite damning of the Americans, indicating that there was a lack of interest in trying to talk about the language included in there, referring only to the Taliban and not taking responsibility for the 20 years of war. Indicating that there is going to be a fallout if the American hegemonic sanctions continue and if there is still going to be a blockade on the economy of Afghanistan, and that they won't be able to support the post-conflict reconstruction and development without there being a functioning economy. So we really are in very interesting times. And I think, it's fascinating how this has all turned around in 20 years.
So, I mean, the Taliban can now say that in 20 years, they've managed to defeat two superpowers. First Russia, now the United States. Where does that put them in terms of stature inside Afghanistan?
The Taliban had quite strong support in the 1990s and up until their removal from power by the Americans once the American occupation took place and an American-sponsored government was replaced them. I think that now what we've seen today and from last night, celebratory gunfire around Kabul, celebratory protests in Kandahar, raising the flag of the Taliban, but also consensus building in places like Jalalabad, where meetings have been held with civil society, trying to reassure them and build the kind of network towards having a government. And this is the most critical stage for the Taliban right now. What they really need to be doing is to ensure security of the country and then to begin with the governance. So we understand that in the next few days, there will be an announcement made as to the inclusive government that they have been negotiating. We are aware that they approximately 90% of the way through the negotiations. And things look promising from the statements that we're receiving, but there is still deep apprehension amongst many of Afghans, and particularly those who feel betrayed and those who have been left behind by the allied forces, concerned that they will not be allowed that free passage, concerned that they will be persecuted by the Taliban, even though there has been amnesty offered, and concern about whether or not there's going to be a deeper humanitarian catastrophe than there already has unfolded.
So the Afghanistan authorities, whatever form that they do take, are going to have to find a way to communicate to the international community, because over time they've become very dependent on aid and support from outside the country, and they can't afford to have that withdrawn suddenly.
Absolutely. The humanitarian catastrophe has been a 20-year catastrophe, but the anticipation is this is going to worsen, particularly since the economy has been frozen and the bank accounts have been frozen. So that creates a huge problem for the Taliban not having sufficient funds to be able to run the economy. Already, the ordinary people on the streets are starting to feel it. There are lack of jobs, especially with the Allied forces leaving, because many people were employed by the Allied troops, but also lack of basic necessities that would have been imported. Yesterday, thankfully, the World Health Organization landed in Mazar-e-Sharif with quite a lot of medical equipment that would be distributed through Afghanistan. We know that Médecins Sans Frontières is still operating. The United Nations has a number of their humanitarian agencies within Afghanistan that are still operating, some of them from outside, and those who have been evacuated. But the United Nations assistance mission will be reaching the end of its mandate in just a couple of weeks, and the questions now will arise as to whether that mandate will be extended, what role the United Nations would play from a security perspective, and what role the neighborhood and neighboring countries of Afghanistan would be playing. So it's quite interesting. But today, we also heard from the spokesperson, Zabihullah Mujahid, that the Taliban want to have relations with all of the world. And that is quite a positive indication. The question is, does the world want to have relations with the Taliban? And I think that's where negotiations and consideration has to be raised. China has definitely indicated they're interested. Iran is making overtures, Turkey is making overtures, and in terms of running of the Kabul airport, we know that Turkey and Qatar have both indicated that they would try and render support from an expertise perspective to at least keep things running and to have some momentum.
We know that the West will give support, I guess, with conditions. Human rights issues perhaps might be put on the table. But will countries like China, who traditionally are the type of country that says we will not interfere in anybody's country because they expect the same for themselves. And if they do get support from countries like China, then might that swing the way that they go in terms of charting a course forward?
Well, Afghanistan lies in a very geostrategic position, and particularly for China. There is the China Road and Belt Initiative, and so Afghanistan falls within a similar range, and this would be very opportunistic for China to get involved right now. Their statements have been damning of the Americans, but consistently they have been indicating that there needs to be investment in Afghanistan. I expect that that would be conditional, and they have included that into their statements, that Afghanistan cannot be used, similarly to what the Americans have said, as a base for any attacks on any foreign countries. The Chinese are particularly concerned about the Uyghurs. There were a number of Uyghurs who were in Afghanistan at the time of the American occupation, and so there is a relationship between the Uyghurs and the Taliban. Now, what China is concerned about is whether this will become some kind of resistance, and we know that in East Turkestan that there have been Chinese control measures taken place and re-education camps for Muslim Chinese that is very controversial in terms of human rights. But I think that what also comes across is that the United States and its allies cannot walk away from this without acknowledging that they have created humanitarian disaster and they have perpetrated war crimes in Afghanistan. The questions now that will arise is whether these will be acknowledged, whether these will be exposed. And interestingly, there is a new campaign that was launched yesterday that will be running for the next 5 months. It's called the International Witness Campaign, that involves advocacy groups and human rights activists from across the world, from approximately 45 countries, who will be utilizing the next 5 months to draw attention to those atrocities that were perpetrated by the Americans in the global war on terror.
Security is going to be a big issue, especially now we've seen what happened in the last 48 hours, ISIS-K, and the casualties. Can the Taliban manage this? Because that's going to be a big headache for them if there's a rise in insurgency that they have to deal with.
There's definitely a security vacuum that's been created, and there's been massive proliferation of arms and weapons. A lot of it has been left behind by the Americans, although they have disabled a number of them, of the aircraft, for example, at the airport. So this creates quite a unique situation in Afghanistan. The Taliban have indicated that they are making overtures to warlords. They are trying to deal with the criminal syndicates. They do perceive ISIS-K as a threat, and we saw what happened at Kabul Airport with the suicide attack. But what we also need to acknowledge, Peter, is that many of the casualties on that night were not as a result of the suicide attack, but as a result of the Americans opening fire on the crowds, and numerous civilians were killed as a result of that gunfire. The response from the Americans had been a drone attack, and that was supposed to have been targeted against an ISIS-K member. Instead, it killed an entire family. 9 civilians were killed. 6 of them were children. And this is something that Afghans have been at the mercy of for decades. Drone attacks, there's a story of a young boy who says he prefers cloudy skies instead of sunshine because it means that they're that much more protected from the drone attacks. Now, Joe Biden, in as much as they have left Afghanistan, has reserved the right to continue with airstrikes and drone attacks in Afghanistan if they perceive that there would be a threat. This is really problematic because not only would it impede on the sovereignty of a country, but it would also be causing additional casualties that we have seen in the last 20 years.
All right. So what of America's allies? Do they have the same appetite that Joe Biden has, or have they washed their hands of this now because they too suffered a number of casualties over time?
Definitely, they've suffered casualties, and I think that this has created a political situation in the UK. It's created backlash from civil society across NATO nations, and it's almost as if they were dragged into this war by the Americans. We experienced something very, very unusual 20 years ago. The Twin Towers came down, and suddenly everything in our world changed. And the Americans had pushed through laws, regulations, legislation across the world that completely transformed how we interact with each other, what it means to identify people as terrorists. Islamophobia crept in very deeply in Europe, and we're still seeing the remnants of that in terms of the laws that have been promulgated in places like the United Kingdom, in Austria, and even in parts of Africa. In the UK, you have a program called Prevent, that is supposed to help identify people who might have terrorist leanings, but instead it has targeted young children who may have simply worn a scarf to school or maybe said something like Allahu Akbar, which means God is great. And suddenly they're being yanked away from their parents and taken into social security because they're deemed to be trained as terrorists. In Austria, there was a mass raid on any person who seemed to express sentiments towards the Muslim Brotherhood. Subsequent to that, there has been a court case that has actually won on behalf of those people who were raided, and they've been able to win the case against the state and to reclaim their rights. So civil liberties have been really taken away from a number of people, and these are things that need to be looked at as an outcome of what has happened in the 20 years. It isn't just Afghanistan that has suffered. We have to remember places like Abu Ghraib in Iraq, where the worst of torture and crimes had taken place against Iraqis who had been detained there. We have to remember Guantanamo Bay is still open. And what I think we need to also connect the dots around is many of those people who were renditioned to Guantanamo Bay from Afghanistan. It happened as a result of leaflets that were thrown out of helicopters by the Americans, offering ransom and offering money towards anyone who could hand over a person who was suspected of being part of the Taliban. or Al-Qaeda. People who were just wearing a Casio watch were deemed to be terrorists, not for any other reason. The Northern Alliance rounded up a whole lot of these people. No actual evidence of them being terrorists or being part of Al-Qaeda, and they were shipped off to black sites like Bagram and then to Guantanamo Bay. We know that several of these Guantanamo Bay detainees from the age of 11 to the age of 84, many of them were found not guilty, but there was no habeas corpus, there was no rule of law, and there still remains 40-something Guantanamo Bay detainees who have not been given justice and not been allowed to present their cases in court. These are issues that we also need to look at and cannot forget as we look at what Afghanistan is going to be going forward.
Zeenat, thank you very, very much indeed. Yeah, looks like there's going to be quite an unpacking, a significant transition period. And who knows what Afghanistan's going to look like next, but certainly we know you'll be watching for us. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.